Okay, I think we'll start. I'm just going to do a quick review from last week, and then before I get into today, I'll just tell you what's happening over the next few weeks, just a bit of housekeeping. So, last week we just began by explaining how the Ten Commandments are very simple things, and this is picked up by the commentaries, and we talked about two ideas behind that. Number one was, they sound simple, but some of the details not so simple, and emphasizes the concept of a system which is a system of morality, but absolute morality, a divine morality. And that's why some of the detail, the principles are simple, but not always so simple in terms of the application. And they are Torah principles because they are given in a particular way with particular specifics. And the second idea was that they're simple because that's the point. The point of Judaism is not only to connect spiritually and in very lofty and detached ways, but the whole point of Judaism is something we'll talk about a bit later on today, as well, is that to bring God into the simple, to bring God into the routine, to do things in a godly way that are not in a shul, or not necessarily in a place of learning, but in our just daily routine, in our daily interaction with society or the environment around us, right? We talked about murder, so we talked about the whole idea of importance of life and the absolute morality of God, which is intrinsic life, not just always quality of life, but just life itself. Also, absolute morality means that sometimes it's good to do those things. So murder, of course, or killing people is generally a very terrible thing, but there are times when we're supposed to do that, like in times of war or other times and so on. Self-defense or whatever the case is. Come in. Also, we talked about a spiritual, not a spiritual, but an emotional form of murder, which is forbidden. An extension of the commandment of not to kill also includes not to compromise the dignity of others, that's why we talked about this idea of malbin pnei chaviro barabim, someone who humiliates someone else in public. Humiliation is a form of murder. It's a form of embarrassment of other people, compromising their dignity, compromising their imprint of the godly image in which they were created, which is also a concept of a subtle form of murder, so to speak. And that's why we talked about the importance of creating an awareness and sensitivity to others' feelings, to what others' needs, and so on. And we shared a few stories. Okay. Today, actually, I want to do 3 of the commandments, and then let me just share with you what we're going to do. So we'll do 3 commandments today, which will take us to commandment number 9, and then we're going to save next week for number 10. It's a big topic. But before we do that, let me just give you the plan for the rest of the term, so to speak. It's a long term this term. So we're going to do one more week on this topic. Then in 2 weeks' time, we're going to do a special one. I do this every year. I embarrass myself because I like the concept of Jewish birthdays. So we'll do a special one and honor my birthday, which always comes around that time. We'll have a coffee cart, a bit of a cake, and I'll share with you an idea. So my birthday always comes, in the Hebrew calendar, of course, always comes just after the yahrzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on the 3rd of Tammuz. So I'm going to share with you, I've called it 5 minutes that changed my life. And I'm going to share with you a conversation and the lessons learned from that conversation that I had in a private audience with the Rebbe when I was 13, just for 5 minutes. But it was very, very impactful. Okay, so that's the 18th of June. The only reason why I do this, by the way, just so you know, it's not, I actually don't like to make a big fuss on my birthday, but the Rebbe instructed us to do that. He wants people to make a thing and to show gratitude and to share their gratitude with others, so that's why I do it. Then we're going to do a 2-week series, because last week, I think it was last week, yeah, we talked about some real ethical dilemmas that come around end of life, and I shared with you very briefly some of what Rabbi Tatz teaches and so on. So I thought that we, just before the end of the term, we'll do a 2-week series on some moral ethical dilemmas, especially in areas of medicine, like medical ethics. It'll be a little bit different to what we normally do, but fascinating. So that will be for 2 weeks. That's the 25th of June and the 2nd of July. and then we'll end with that, and we'll take a couple of weeks break. All right? So we'll take a, so that's it. So the next week, again, so it's 4 weeks. I'm just outlining the next 4 weeks. So next week we're going to finish the series, then a special one the week after, and then 2 weeks of ethical dilemmas in terms of medicine and medical life issues that we'll do for 2 weeks. That will take us to the 2nd of July, and then we'll take a little break over the school holidays. Okay. So I said we're going to do three of the commandments, but before I do that, I came across a very interesting article by Rabbi Sachs that I want to just share with you a little bit, because it's actually an interesting perspective, very bit different than normal. And that is the following. He starts his article with the thing that we started with at the beginning of the series, which is that they're not 10 commandments, they're 10 principles, they're 10 utterances, right? Because they're called Aseret HaDibrot. And they're not called Aseret Mitzvot, they're not called 10 commandments, they're called 10 sayings, right? Some of them have more than one mitzvah, and the first one is even a dispute among the very early halachic authorities whether it's a mitzvah altogether, whether you can call, there's a thing in there if you want, whether you can actually call faith a mitzvah or not. That's a separate discussion. Bottom line is 10 principles. What he does is, normally the 10 commandments, or as we call them the 10 commandments, are split into two. The first 5 and the second 5. The 5 between man and God, and the 5 between man and man, as we've discussed. But he offers a whole bit of a different structure, and he says there are 10 foundational principles divided into 3 groups, and then the 10th commandment is a separate group, which is an interesting perspective, and he explains it in the following way. I just wanted to give you that perspective, which is interesting. And he says what makes them very special is that they're simple concepts and easy to remember. And he says a nice sentence. He says that is because in Judaism, law is not intended for judges alone, right? The covenant at Sinai was made by God with the entire people. So therefore, we all have to be able to have access, right? Sometimes in secular law, it's different because you have to be a lawyer to have access and know how to study the law. In Judaism, everyone has access to Jewish learning and Jewish concepts and Jewish information. And even with the mitzvot and the laws, they are made in a way where we can access them. Obviously, we can do them deeply, and it's no end, it's endless, but nevertheless, especially the 10 commandments were communicated to an entire nation, and therefore packaged in sort of a simple foundational package. So he says the first 3, which is I am God. I mean, we've gone through these, but just to clarify, revise. I am God, you shall have no other gods, and don't use my name in vain. Those 3 are about a God, having a God, a creator, right? Having a God, not a creator so much, just believing in God. Believing that there is a God and making God part of our lives, right? We know that one of the greatest downfalls of today's society is that we are living in a godless world. And I mean, not only in Judaism, by the way, every religion will tell that they're battling, right? Because people don't see the purpose. When you live in a very me, as I always say, in a very me context, then you don't see the need for God. You become your own God, and it's a problem. And therefore, therefore there's no higher connection, there's no higher purpose. It's emptiness, really. That's what leads to all sorts of terrible things. And therefore, the first set of the commandments, which is the first 3, is about God, believing in God, not having other gods, not believing in physicality of God. In other words, that's why you can't have idols, and not using God's name in vain. The second 3 are about creation. It's an extension of the first 3. In other words, it's an extension of this concept. Once you believe in God, then you believe also that God is the creator and is the source of everything, right? And that is expressed in 3 mitzvot. Number 1, Shabbat. Shabbat, of course, is the concept. The whole idea of Shabbat is the belief in creation. 6 days God created the world, and the 7th day He rested. Whatever that means on so many different levels, but as we've talked about in different times, but that's the basic principle, that He every day created something different, and on Shabbat He didn't create. Shabbat is a transcendent day. It's a day that transcends creation, a day of calmness, a day of rest, a day of being, whatever the case might be. But Shabbat expresses that emunah, that faith, that the world didn't come from itself, it came from God. The same thing is with the next one, which is honoring parents. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, of one of the great commentaries, the Kli Yakar, who explains that the whole idea why honoring parents is on the right side of the tablets, which are between man and God, is because it's also about creation. It's about remembering that we don't come from ourselves. And once we acknowledge and honor the parents that gave birth to us, then we recognize that they came from their parents, and ultimately everything has a source, and the ultimate source, of course, is the creative power of God that He created. And then that actually goes into the sixth commandment, which is the third one of the second group, which is the concept of murder, which we said is because it's also about creation. It's about understanding that creation is in the image of God, as particularly human beings who are created in the image of God, and therefore murder is such a terrible sin. So that's the second three. So there's belief in God, and then creation. The third is the basics of society, the foundational concepts of society. And they are, don't commit adultery, which we're going to talk about today, not stealing, and not bearing false witness. And he explains, Rabbi Sachs, very beautifully that, of course, family structure, ultimately not committing adultery is about the family structure. Family structure, of course, it plays out differently, sometimes with different people, but the family structure is really, again, something that we lack today, tremendously respect for that family structure. But family, that connection, that intrinsic coming together of a family, that's so basic to a functional society. Marriage, being an exclusive relationship between us and God, is also expressed in that commandment. And then, of course, theft, which is about honesty. You can't have a society that lacks integrity, that lacks honesty. That's one of the things that are the breakdown of the society structure. So, if there's no concept of family unit and family in general, if there's no integrity, if there's falsehood, if there's not, and if there's stealing, obviously stealing is between, it's the integrity of property, just like in other words that there's integrity of ownership, and that different people have different things, and once there's stealing, once there's theft, once there's deceit, or once there's dishonesty, which is the concept of not bearing false witness, so of course that breaks down society. And then he says a very interesting thing, which of course is absolutely correct. And he says those are the three groups. So it's belief in God, belief in the creative power of God, and then the foundations of a society. And then there's the 10th one who stands alone, and that's jealousy. I'm not going to go into too much today because we'll talk about it next week. But actually, he says correctly that probably the number one, or one of the number one things that breaks down society is envy, right? The desire to have what other people have, the desire to be what other people are, right? He brings from Rene Girard, I'm not sure who that is actually, apparently wrote a book called Violence and the Sacred. She said the primary driver of the human violence is the desire to be to have what someone else has, which is ultimately the desire to be what someone else is, right? And what happens is envy, he says, which is actually spoken about in the Rambam, envy can lead to breaking many of the other commands. It can move people to adultery, theft, false testimony, even murder. It led Cain to murder Abel, right? It led Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery. It's the envy of their neighbors that led the Israelites often to imitate the religious practices and worship other gods. All these things at the root comes from envy, but we'll develop that a lot next week. But it is interesting that that's a standalone, and that becomes one of the most foundational principles, because it really leads to everything else. And this actually comes from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, which has a famous passage which says that kin'ah, which is jealousy, lust, and pursuit of glory, destroy a person, right? That's interesting. It has it in that order, because the truth is, lust also comes from jealousy. You need things other people have, right? So therefore, kin'ah, the jealousy concept, is the primary driver of everything else and destroys a person. That actually was Pirkei Avot said. So I just wanted to share that with you because I thought it was an interesting perspective of how you break down, different to what we said before about the 5 and the 5. This is sort of a novel approach about breaking the 10 Commandments as 3 foundational groups, and then the last being envy. Okay. So as I said, I wanted to go through three of the commandments today. So the one is command number 7, which is do not commit adultery, which is fairly simple. But by extension, actually, it applies to all of the laws of sexuality and sexual depravity in the Torah. Torah has many, many different things that govern sexual behavior. And I wanted to just make 2 points about this command. Number 1, that by extension, it's actually not just in marriage, right? One of the lessons of this command is the following, that relationships, right, and growth in general requires a sacrifice. Right? This is what often people don't understand that they want everything. You can't do that. Sometimes connecting to something in a deeper way, right, needs a sacrifice. Now, what's interesting is, I've shared this with you before, that the commentaries explain that the two sets of tablets, the 5 and 5, correspond to each other. So therefore, the 7th one, which is the second one on the left side, corresponds to the second one on the right side. What's the second one on the right side? Which comes after the first one, which is God says, I am God, your God, believe in me. The second one is, do not have any other idols. Do not serve idols, right? In other words, God is teaching us, if you want any relationship on both of these commands, if you want any meaningful relationship, there has to be a certain commitment and a certain exclusivity to that relationship, right? Obviously, the most deepest relationship that we have is marriage, and of course, that's where the deepest exclusivity rests, right? And we know that the relationship between people, and particularly in marriage, is similar and symbolic of the relationship between us and God. And therefore, a relationship requires to give up something else. If I commit to someone, or to something for that matter, it means I have to detach and let go of something else. In growth, it works like that also. I cannot grow to something higher than myself unless I'm prepared to let go of myself. I cannot take the next step in my growth if I'm still stuck in where I was before. Even if I do something a little bit better, I improve a little bit. You know, the Talmud tells an interesting story of a great sage called Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera lived in Babylon, and he made Aliyah. He moved to Israel because he wanted to study under the Israeli sages. There was a time in Jewish history after the Second Temple, it didn't last for that long, but there was a time where the center of Jewish learning was in two places, in Israel and in Babylon. Right? They were until the Mishnah came along, was always in Israel, but then Jews migrated and scholars went to move to Babylon and so on. And there became these major academies in Babylon, but for a while there was still the major academies in Israel. So there were two. Now, which is why, by the way, we actually have the Talmud that we normally study is called the Babylonian Talmud. But there actually is also a Jerusalem Talmud, which is shorter, more difficult to understand actually. And it's the teachings that were taught specifically in Israel by the Israeli sages, the Talmudic sages, right? Now, at that time, it was considered that the study of the studying that took place in Israel was far superior than the studying that took place in Babylon, right? So that was one of the reasons why Rabbi Zera wanted to go live in Israel, because he wanted to study under the great Talmudic sages of Israel and adopt their methodology and understand their educational principles to be able to understand the method of study in Israel. Why am I telling you all of this? Because it says in the Talmud that Rabbi Zera fasted a whole number of fasts because he wanted to forget the Babylonian Talmud before he went to Israel. What does that mean? He obviously didn't forget his learning. He was a knowledgeable guy and he kept his knowledge. Forgetting knowledge is not a good thing. You need to try and retain knowledge, which is sometimes hard, but of course you retain it. What it meant was he fasted, he went through a process to wipe off, to cleanse, so to speak, to reset his brain, kind of thing. In other words, to detach from the Babylonian system. Because he felt that if he doesn't do that, he might go to Israel and he might study under the Israeli sages, but that will be his previous mindset, his previous paradigm is going to interfere with trying to grasp and really understand the methodology of Israel. In other words, this was the principle. In order to really embrace something completely new, you have to let go of something old, right? We know that when Moses came to the burning bush, I'm sure I've shared this before, but when Moses came to the burning bush and he heard the voice of God calling him, and he saw this burning bush and he saw something very spectacular. He was in the desert, he was taking care of the flock of his father-in-law. He said the words in Hebrew, he said, Asurana, let me go away and approach this burning bush and see what's going on there. And then later discovered it was a godly revelation. But the language he uses is strange. What does it mean, let me go away and approach the bush, right? So Rashi says 4 words which will become a formula, a very, very important formula. And it is, Rashi says, what does it mean? Asura mikan litkarev l'sham. Let me go away from here so that I can come close to there. Meaning, if I come close to there, but I'm still thinking about here, I'm not really coming close, right? And the same is true, and this is the message from this, one of the messages from this commandment. You cannot fully engage in a relationship if you still have other relationships, even in your head. Forget about in practice, right? And that's what the Torah is telling you. A relationship has to, that's why the first two commandments are a relationship with God. And God said they comprise of two components. Have a relationship with me, believe in me, Anochi Hashem Elokecha emunah. But it also means you can't have any other gods. You can't have it both ways. As it goes, yes.
Rabbi, why did fasting have to change his mindset?
So that's a good question. So fasting with regard to the great sages wasn't just fasting. It was like a whole spiritual cleansing experience where they would pray and sort of detach from the world a little bit, and it was like an experience. It wasn't just not eating. And apparently it had that spiritual effect. I don't know, when I fast I just get hungry, but apparently, so it doesn't work for me. But maybe I do other things to detach. No. So, but for the great sages, fasting was like a whole spiritual experience. That's what it meant. Okay. So that's one idea. One idea is this exclusivity of something, and it means giving up, and that's why the world works. To get something good, you have to give up something else. To have a good relationship, a deep relationship, it means investing. It means committing. Committing means there's certain things you can't do, and you can't do other things, and you can't have other people, or whatever in the context of what that relationship is, right? There's a certain loyalty, which means giving up other things that you have to have, which is true, by the way, in all relationships, just not in the same way, obviously, right? When people have people that work for them, for example, they want loyalty. They don't want them to work for them and then worry and do other things at the same time, because that's a conflict of interest kind of thing, right? It can be very simple things, but it's the same idea. In order to have a relationship with one thing, you have to, in order to embrace one thing, in order to grow into one thing, you have to give up something else. And it's hard work sometimes, but that's what the message of this commandment is, besides its obvious, simple message. And then, I want to mention a second point that comes from this. And again, it goes back to this idea of having simple things in the Ten Commandments. And even though they seem so obvious and so simple, right? Particularly with this one, so there's a command about adultery. In other words, it's a command regarding and governing the laws of sexual activity, essentially, right? So why would the Torah do that? And the reason for that is because the Torah, in Judaism, sexuality is actually holy. I think I mentioned this to you before. It's a very fascinating thing. This is why it's such a different perspective in Judaism, right? The word for holiness in Hebrew is what? Kadosh or Kedusha, right? We find that term with regard to God sometimes. He's holy, which means he's transcendent. Right? But when God tells us to be holy, there are very few activities, very few areas of life in the entire Torah where the word holiness is used. Right? The two main, Shabbat is called holy, that's true. But other than that, the two places where you find the word holiness in the Torah is not with regard to how we study Torah. It's not with regard of how we pray. It's actually not in the spiritual experiences. It's in the two most physical experiences: food, eating, and sexual activity, intimacy. Right? Because the ultimate holiness is to bring God into the physical. Like I said, I think last week or the week before, in Judaism, the headquarters of Judaism is not the shul. The shul, and as I said, I'm not discouraging anyone to go to shul, but the headquarters of Judaism is not the shul, because that's the spiritual experience, and spiritual experience is critical, and it's very, very important. And it gives us the ability to then bring God into the physical, but it's not the main thing. The headquarters of Judaism is in the home, because that's where we live physically. Because there's nothing more holy, in God's eyes at least, right? There's nothing more holy than bringing the spiritual into the physical. Living the physical with purpose, living it with holiness, living it under certain guidelines and boundaries, right? Which is why, when I do things of meditation or Kabbalah and so on, like I always explain why in Judaism it's so different than in other disciplines. Often in other religions, meditation or mysticism or spiritual experiences are the end in itself. In Judaism, it's not that way, and it makes a difference of how you meditate and how you delve into mysticism. It makes a very big difference. In other disciplines, that is an end in itself, to escape the physical, because physical is seen as something bad. In Judaism, it's the opposite. The point of detaching is to reconnect. The point of spiritualizing or going to mysticism or meditating or all of these things, which are all important and all very much part of the Jewish experience, is done, but it's done differently because its point is to then come back and bring that into the mundane. Right? And because it's so holy, that's why it made it into the Ten Commandments, what you're not supposed to do. In other words, because it's so holy, it needs to be protected. And because it's so holy, it needs to be done in a specific way, and therefore there are all sorts of laws and mitzvot that govern that area of life, as it does with regard to food. Not because it's wrong, but because it's right, because it's holy. And because it's holy, the Torah provides us with those protective rail guards, so to speak, that we should be able to do it properly, with the right intent and with the right meaning. It shouldn't just be a pleasure-seeking exercise, it should be a deep thing. As we know, it's in Torah, sexuality is not for pleasure, it is also, but it's also for it's a meaningful part of the relationship. And it's to bring holiness, and it's to bring cohesion, and it's to bring families, and it's to bring people together, and so on and so forth. It's a holy thing, right? It's a holy activity, it's a holy experience. That's why it's in the Ten Commandments. That's the lesson why any society can come up with this thing, don't commit adultery. But in the Torah it's different. It's because I'm telling you how to do it right, because it's a holy thing. And that's why these things like don't steal and don't commit adultery, all these very simple things make themselves into the Ten Commandments. Okay. Command number 7 is don't steal. Right? Don't steal. So I want to just make three observations with this regard to this. First of all, just want to share with you the technical understanding of this commandment. Because people don't know that. Everyone says, don't steal is in the Ten Commandments. It actually isn't. Or it is by extension, but actually the Lo Tignov, don't steal, that's in the Ten Commandments, is about kidnapping, not about stealing. Just fun fact, right? Which is a terrible, terrible sin in the Torah, of course. And in fact, the Torah does carry, with certain transgressions, does carry capital punishment under certain circumstances. Very difficult to actually implement, but it's very rare, and it was implemented very rarely, but it does have that concept. And one of the places where capital punishment applies is kidnapping, with an additional offense. The Torah says someone kidnaps another person and then exploits that person to sell them for something. That is capital. It's an offense which is capital punishment, right? Which is quite severe. So that is now. It's also connected to what we talked about with regard to murder. Why it's connected to the dignity of someone, the dignity of another person, right? That's like it's a gross compromise to the dignity of another person to kidnap them or to use them to exploit them and so on. And that's why it's so severe. That's why it comes in the same line as do not murder, as we explained last 2 weeks ago or last week, right? But it can also extend to other things, because sometimes it can actually extend to something that doesn't have a capital offense, but yet is very, very important, which is the concept of not controlling another person. And this we have in relationships, we have in marriages, domestic violence, domestic control, all these kind of things. That's a very, very, very fundamental principle in Torah. It's not just about being not nice. It's about that people are not yours to control, right? The only person we're supposed to control is ourselves, which is probably the hardest one to do. But that's the problem. We all have this. We've talked about this many times. We all have this need for control. The problem is we just place it in the wrong place, and when it gets severe, it becomes abusive, right? So abuse comes from the concept of control, which is the spiritual application of kidnapping someone. In other words, you're kidnapping someone. You're taking control of someone for your own benefit. A foundational principle in Judaism is that no, you don't do that, because you have to respect the individuality of each person. You have to respect their personality, their differences, their perspectives, their way of doing things. Many years ago when we did a series on relationships, healthy relationships, we spoke about this. This is the concept of respect that comes even before love, which the idea is that although a relationship, is particularly a deep relationship, is to create the most incredible bond and oneness, that oneness is only created by the two individuals remaining two separate individuals, right? You remember the analogy I gave you about interesting Jewish law, and that is that a mezuzah or a Torah has many, many letters, and it's the letters that come together to create oneness, right? So you have to have every letter there. It's like a marriage. You have to have every letter there to create that union, right? And then if every letter is in the Torah, or in the mezuzah, or in the tefillin, they become holy. And yet there's a law when you write tefillin or you write mezuzah that every letter must be a standalone. You must have blank parchment surrounding each letter. If one letter slightly touches the other letter, even with a thin line of ink, the whole mezuzah is invalid. You can fix it, but it's invalid, right? Why? Because like a relationship, every individual has to stand alone because every individual is unique. You need them all there, there's a collective responsibility and there's a concept of community. That's all true. We don't stand alone selfishly. We don't stand alone and not worry about other people. That's not true. We have in Judaism very strongly oneness, community, responsibility, and so on, right? Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, as we always talk about all these things, but that's not to the detriment or to the dissolving of the uniqueness of the one person. The individual remains an individual, and that is so important. And perhaps that is one of the extensions, spiritually speaking or emotionally speaking, of this commandment. Don't kidnap other people, which means don't take control of other people. Don't try to dissolve their individuality and take control as if it's yours, because it isn't. And that brings the whole idea of dignity and respect of other people's opinions and respect for other people's dignity and so on and so forth. Okay. But of course, this commandment, as the commentaries point out, is not just about stealing other people. It's also about the general concept of theft, right? Now, I want to show you some interesting perspective on this. On a simple level, it's very simple. Everyone has to have, the world works where people own things and that's their stuff, right? And stealing it creates a dysfunctional society. So you've worked for something, you bought something, you have something, other people have something, but if someone tries to take away what rightfully belongs to you, obviously will undermine the very fabric of society. It'll make a society not be able to work, and it'll just be anarchy and chaos. So that's a very logical law, right? Every society would come up with that law, hopefully, about not stealing other people's things. Unless you're a communist, but otherwise we're talking normal people, normal societies, right? Okay. However, there's a very beautiful, I haven't managed to check the source, I just saw an article based on this idea, but I need to actually check up the original. But nevertheless, we need to actually analyze what that actually means that people own something and actually have the depth of that. Why do I say that? So I'll start with a very cute Hasidic story that they tell about one of the Rebbes. I don't know who it was exactly, but there was a particular Hasid, a particular follower. You know, in Hasidic philosophy, we learn a lot about that. The world really is not such a significant existence, right? God is the ultimate reality, and everything else is sort of different. And the Torah tells us, you know, there's a pasuk, there's a verse in Psalms where King David says, "La Hashem ha'aretz u'mla'ah." The world and everything that's in it really belongs to God. And that's it, you know. So they tell a story about an individual who was not so careful with his financial obligations, about paying people back and all this kind of stuff. And he got summoned by the Rebbe one day. And he said, "Is it true that you borrow money and you don't repay, and you buy in credit, you don't pay," that kind of thing, right? So the guy was being a smart Alex. He says to the Rebbe, he says, "But what do you mean? You've always taught us that this world is really nothing, material pursuit is nothing. Why are they making such a big deal out of a couple of rubles? You know, like, come on, pull it, it's nothing anyways, you know." So the Rebbe looked at him and he said, "You know, if that's the case, maybe you're right. So what we'll do is," and he pointed to him, he says, "We'll take this nothing," meaning him, "we'll place you on a nothing, like a table, which is also nothing, it's part of the physical world, and we'll give you 10 nothings, like, you know, and it should be okay, right? Because it's all nothing anyway." Yeah. Okay, so it's a cute story. But actually, it has a bit of depth to it, because everything does belong to God. That's true. So what does it mean? What does ownership actually mean in Judaism, right? Now we know that ownership exists because God commands us, don't steal other people's things, right? But is it just a mechanism to keep society functioning, or is there a real meaning of owning something? Okay? So I'll tell you a very interesting thing, which is a bit connected to this. there's a passage in the Talmud that talks about making a blessing before eating. We have in Judaism, to make a bracha before we eat, right? What's the idea? Make a bracha before we eat. We recognize that everything comes from God and we show gratitude and etc. So how does it come about, this idea? So the Talmud says that there's two contradictory verses in the Torah. One is, it says, La Hashem, like I just said to you, La Hashem ha'aretz imla'a. The world and everything that's in it belongs to God. Okay? But then it says, Hashamayim, we say this in Hallel, Hashamayim shamayim la Hashem, the heaven is God's area, v'ha'aretz, and the earth, natan livnei adam, He gave it to the people. So which is it? Belong to God, or did He give it to us? Right? So the Talmud makes an interesting observation and says, no, they're both true. One is before you make the bracha, one is after you make the bracha. Right? When you acknowledge that everything belongs to God, then He says, now this is yours, and you can take care of it. Right? Okay. Well, why? What's the concept? So Rabbi Akiva in the Talmud says this is actually a very important concept, because it goes actually to the purpose of creation. Rabbi Akiva says that when you defraud someone, when you steal from someone, you are undermining, you are attacking the third partner, right? The third part of the creation. What he means by third partner, it means God, in other words, because the third partner comes from an expression where the Talmud says that there's three partners that create a human being. There's the mother, the father, and God, right? You're creating the third partner. So in other words, God's a partner in so there's me, there's my friend, and I steal from them. I'm one partner, he's another partner, and God is the third, and we're defrauding him. Like that's why theft is so terrible. So the converse asks the question, what do you mean? Why don't we just say we're defrauding God? The only partner kind of thing, the only owner. And the answer is no. The answer is that God, we know this principle, we've talked about this before, that in Hasidic philosophy we learn that God created the world for us to invite Him in. Because He wanted a home. This is the idea. He wanted a home He wanted to come and live where He's not obvious. In the upper worlds, in the spiritual worlds, He's very obvious. That wasn't the purpose of creation. The purpose of creation was to create a world where He's not here, and He wanted us to invite Him. Right? So that can happen in various ways. God can create a world where He's not obvious, a physical, mundane world where you don't see God in the obvious way, and He can move in. No, but that wasn't the purpose. The purpose of creation is that He wanted us to invite Him in. Right? He wanted us to extend the invitation to Him. So He says, I'm going to give you the world. It's actually a real ownership. So ownership is not just a good system of a functional society. Ownership is the real thing. When I own something, it's actually really mine. That's why, although it says in the verse, everything belongs to God, but when God gave it to us to do a mitzvah, He gave us a house so we could put a mezuzah and invite Him in. He gave us candles so we could light them on Friday night and invite Him into the physical world. Right? He gave us it is ours. And therefore when and He gives each person what they need. And He gives each person what they can use to make the world a better place, to make it a more godly place. Right? And therefore, Rabbi Akiva says, we are actually real partners in this equation. And therefore he said, but we have to respect that partnership. And we have to respect the purpose of that partnership. So stealing is not just about doing something immoral because it undermines the functionality of a society. Stealing is bad because it undermines the purpose of society, not just the functionality of society. It's an expression of you don't know why you have your things to begin with. And you don't know why the other person has his things to begin with. We have everything we have in order to live a life of purpose. And God gave us what we need and He gave it to us. He says it's yours, use it well. Use it for a purpose. And He gave us the mechanism to live with that purpose, but use it. Use it to give charity, use it to help other people, use it for godly mitzvot, use it for a good purpose. But don't take away someone else's because someone else has what they have in order to achieve that same purpose. And therefore, when you steal from someone, you're not just starting out with the other person, you're starting out with me. You're defrauding me because I gave each person what they have to have in order to achieve their purpose in life. That's just a bit of a depth to the concept of don't steal. But now I want to just take you to one area where it's good to steal. Okay? Where's it good to steal? So as I told you, the Talmud says that most things in the Torah where the Torah said it was forbidden, there's always a place where it says it's a good thing. Like an area. So what? Like for example, he said not to make a fire on Shabbat, but he said in the temple you should bring sacrifice on Shabbat. All these different things, right? So where's the good to steal? So the Zohar has an interesting thing. The Zohar says that what you're allowed to steal is, you can steal Torah. What does that mean? So I'll just tell you a cute story. The founder of the Chabad movement known as the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shnei Zalman of Ladi, he was a great mystic and a great scholar, but he came to study by the famous Maggid of Mezrich, who was the student of the Baal Shem Tov, right? Now at that time, when the Alter Rebbe arrived at the Maggid of Mezrich, he was already a very, very great scholar, but his emphasis in learning was more the halachic part of Torah, the Talmudic part of Torah. And he desperately wanted to really delve into the ultimate depths of the mystical part of Torah. So he made a partnership with someone. Who was that? That was someone that was the son of the Mezrich, the Maggid of Mezrich, who also was a great scholar in all areas of Torah, but his emphasis was mysticism, Kabbalah, the esoteric part of learning. So they made a deal between them. They made a deal they're going to become learning partners, and they'll do increments of 3 hours, right? For 3 hours, the son of the Maggid of Mezrich will guide him to go to the very depths of the mystical part of learning. And for the next 3 hours, he'll guide him in the Talmudic part of learning and share his expertise. So the Maggid of Mezrich started to do that, and Alter Rebbe loved it so much, so he secretly tampered with the clock, so that she should have longer time. Yeah. But there's a very big lesson here. The very big lesson is that everything has a purpose in life. Everything has a purpose, right? There's nothing that has, even evil things have purpose, have a purpose, and we always have to see what is the purpose with. So if theft exists, which is such a terrible thing, what's the purpose in theft? The purpose in theft is that sometimes, we say we don't have time. We would love to do something good. We would love to learn more, but we don't have time. Right? I met someone the other day. I was talking to them. They haven't gone to a shir in months. They say, I'm so busy. My business has become very busy. So I don't start up with people. I don't try to judge them. But I was thinking, but you didn't give up eating, right? I mean, you still have time to eat, right? So there are things in life that we're supposed to do, good things, holy things, and sometimes we blame it on time. And the truth is, no. Torah says you need to learn how to steal. You need to steal a bit of time from other things that you're doing and bring them into good things. Like Alter Rebbe stole that time in order to learn what he wanted to learn. Was Torah, was holiness. His thirst for holiness was so that he led him to steal, which was the good stealing. It's the thing that the Zohar says, Tignov, you're allowed to steal. So there's a place for stealing sometimes as well. Okay. Which leads us on just very briefly to the 9th commandment, which is not bearing false testimony, right? Which, by the way, in the correspondence between the different commandments, it corresponds to Shabbat, which Shabbat we learn is a form of testimony. It's about pronouncing and testifying to the fact that God created the world. So here we have this idea of not bearing false testimony in court, which is also the same idea of untruth, in other words, right? Now, it's not just about bearing false testimony and lying under oath, right? I heard a funny story once about honesty. So the funny name. There was a great rabbi in England, I think, and he was he had to testify about something. He was a very, very big rabbi. His name was Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky, and he had to testify for someone in court. So the judge asked him, "Is it true, Rabbi, they say about you that you're such a big rabbi and you have a lot of students and you're very knowledgeable and you're one of the leading rabbis of things?" He says, "Yes, absolutely true." So the judge was taken aback a bit. He says, "Rabbi, it's not very humble the way you're speaking." He says, "Your Honor, I'm under oath." Anyway, so this thing about not lying in court, obviously, again, these commandments are specific, but then they extend. And it extends to the concept of being honest, integrity. Integrity, honesty is one of the foundations of living in general, right? Now, in Judaism, it's an unbelievable foundation. So much so that we learn that the rabbis teach in the Talmud that the signet ring, the brand of God is truth, right? He's an eternal and true God, and his brand is truth. I put there on the handout the 3 letters of truth, emet, which is Aleph, Mem, and Taf, right? You'll notice that Aleph is the beginning of the alphabet, the Jewish alphabet, Mem is the middle, and Taf is the end, right? Because truth is something that has to infiltrate and be the guiding light to everything that we do, right? From beginning till the end, yeah? And that's the essence of truth. And that's why the idea of truth is so important. Honesty, not stealing. In fact, there's even a law in Torah about what's called Gnevat Dat, when you create a false impression. Stealing someone's mind is actually also prohibited. To use it in more modern context, it goes into the whole thing like false advertising. Like, am I allowed to, or even just create an impression that, okay, false advertising could hurt people, but I'm saying this is even about, for example, it says in the Talmud, you're not supposed to, let's say you're making a simcha, for example, right? And there's, you're limited. You can only invite a certain amount of people. And there's a certain person you're not planning to invite them. Then you hear that they're going overseas anyway. So you decide, you send them an invitation. Why not? I get some points. He's not going to come anyway. So you're not allowed to do that. It's actually forbidden. Because you're creating an impression that, of a greater friendship that doesn't actually exist. Right? All these kind of things. So that's why, because truth is so important. However, as we said, it's not always the most important thing, which is fascinating. Now, I'm going to tell you something that's actually quite dangerous. There is a concept that we learn in Torah about, we said the brand of God is truth, but it also says that the Torah was given to make peace in the world. So we have these actually conflicting values. Sometimes. They can be in conflict, right? There is a concept, Rabbi Sachs points this out, that, the great philosopher Immanuel Kant said that even if there was a murderer that went into, how does it go again? He says that if a murderer was at large and holding a gun, and he came into your house and he was hiding there, and police come and say, is he in your house? No, sorry, how's it going? One second. Yeah, I don't understand the scenario, actually, to be honest. But even if it was something that you could save someone, in other words, you could save other people by lying, you have to do it. No, you can't. He said you can't lie, because lie is an absolute. Now, in Torah, it doesn't work like that, right? We know it doesn't work like that, but particularly in this case, because there is times that we actually permitted, and there is times we're actually obligated to lie, right? That's a very dangerous message, that, because that can be abused, okay? But let's just go through that. So first of all, we know this idea that actually sometimes peace trumps honesty. I'll give you an example. There's a concept, they have this in modern day court also, but there's a concept in Jewish law when people come for litigation, right? And I say you owe me $10,000, you say you don't owe me a penny, so it's a conflict, right? The dayanim, the judges, are, once they start the case, and once they're going to pronounce, if that's what people want, if they want to follow up with the litigation, then they've got to research it and follow the letter of the law, who's right and who's wrong. But actually, the better thing to do is to start off by offering them what's called a pshara, compromise, and basically what they call today a settlement, right? Okay, so they agree, let's say, and they agree that we'll be on $5,000. He pays $5,000, and everyone's kind of happy, right? But you have to understand that settlement is a lie. It's not true. If I say owe me $10,000, you don't say you owe me a penny, one of us is lying, right? And then if you give me $5,000, it's not true, because someone is holding on to $5,000 that doesn't belong to them, correct? And yet we promote it, because truth is sometimes peace is greater than truth. That's why Moses' brother, we know that Moses had a brother called Aaron. So Moses was the symbol of truth, because it says Torah Temet, and his brother was the symbol of peace. And what the Talmud tells us, that Aaron would go around and he'd make peace with people. Well, how would he do it? If he knew there was discord, people hated each other or they were upset with each other, he would go to each party separately and he would say, the other guy really wants to make up. He just doesn't, he feels embarrassed. He would tell the same story to the other guy, and it wasn't true. And then they'd meet in the street and each one felt embarrassed and they'd make up. He would do things like that, right? Just to make peace, because peace is so important. And the Torah says that, and the Talmud says there are certain times we're allowed to, for the sake of protecting other people or for the sake of humility, all these things we're allowed to tell a white lie. For example, You can tell a lie, like we say, to resolve a conflict. You can tell a lie for humility. Say someone, unlike that rabbi in court, he says he was under oath, but if he wasn't under oath, you can actually lie. You can underestimate yourself. You can say, no, if someone says, do you know the entire Talmud? You can say, no, not really. Even though maybe you do, right? But you can do that. Or you can lie to protect other people. For example, there's an example given in the Talmud that, if you've went on a trip and you stayed by someone hosted you, but really he doesn't want to host other people. He just wants to host you because you're a good friend of his. And then someone meets you and says, I heard you stayed by Mr. Cohen. How's the accommodation there? What's the quality? Right? So you can actually lie. You can say, actually, it wasn't that great, even though you had a fantastic time. Why are you protecting the other guy? You don't want them to start nudging him because he doesn't. He doesn't want, right? But those things. So there is a concept. God lied in the Torah. God lied to protect. God lied when He came after when Sarah. Oh, that's right. When Sarah laughed. Right. God, the angels told Abraham he's going to have a child, right? And Abraham sort of said, but he was very old. He was surprised, and then. Sorry. And then Sarah overheard the conversation. No, not Sarah. And then Sarah laughed and she said, how are we going to have a child? I'm so old and my husband is so old, right? So then God said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And then he quoted Sarah, but he misquoted her. God said that Sarah said, how am I going to have a child if I'm so old? He didn't quote the part that Sarah said, my husband is so old. Because he didn't want to make sorrows between Abraham and Sarah, right? So you can lie. However, here's the principle, and I'll just quickly do it because we're out of time. But the principle, because it's a very dangerous thing, because people lie and they say that's a white lie, but they're not. It's just a selfish lie because they want to get themselves out of trouble and not be accountable and kind of thing, right? That's actually forbidden. The basic principle is when it's selfish, you can never lie, right? A white lie is only a good if you're doing it for someone else's benefit, or you're doing it to protect someone else's interests, or you're doing it to resolve conflict, or you're doing it to protect another human being, like God did, right? That, in other words, if it's for selfless purposes, obviously not every selfless purpose warrants a lie either. But generally speaking, when it's for your own benefit, you're not allowed to lie. You have to be an honest person because the brand of God is truth. There's only certain times where we say that peace takes over truth, or certain cases which allow you to lie but it's always because it's always when it's hard to lie. In other words, always when you don't actually, people want to lie all the time just to protect themselves. They make up stories all the time, but that's for their own interests. That's not a good lie. It's not for peace, it's just for their own protection, right? And therefore lack of accountability and all that. But when it's to protect other people, when it's going beyond yourself, then there are instances where lying is okay, and lying sometimes even obligatory. Or the best thing is, I'll just end with this, that sometimes there's an expression in Yiddish, because sometimes people create problems when they say the truth. You got to always say the truth. Then they create big problems between people. So there's an expression in Yiddish that mitornish liegen, you're not allowed to lie, but you don't always have to say the whole truth. Sometimes just be quiet. It's also a good strategy sometimes, right? Because making discord between people and making machlokes and conflict between people is also not a good thing, because you're bringing in the opposite of peace, right? So therefore, a person has to be clever and understand when everything applies. Okay, so once again, next week we'll do the final commandments. It's a one that's about envy and coveting and all that. And then a special session in 2 weeks' time, and then we'll do that 2-week series on ethics. Have a wonderful day. How are you? It was mother and son today, you know that?
I know, Mikey's at my house and he said...
Mikey was here learning with Levi, yeah?
I was so much.
That's beautiful.
It was great.
Thank you.
I'll see you next week.
Great.
Rabbi, I'm going away for a few weeks.
Oh.
I'm going to Poland and Berlin.
Oh, really? Wow. Going with other people?
Yeah, with the Jewish Museum.
Oh, nice. Wow, that's amazing. Well, I hope you have some good stories to tell when you come back. I'm sure you will.
See if I can
travel well and
manage it. Yeah,
it's a hard one.
Right, bye.
Welcome.
How are you?
Good thing. Thank you.
You just settled something in my head that's been going in my head for years, so thank you.
Okay, that's good.
My late mom passed away when she was 63. I was 33. And I got a